It's Wednesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Steve Baker, Shadow Attorney General Emily Thornberry, Financial Times Whitehall editor Sebastian Payne and Sunday Times political editor Caroline Wheeler. Today, will the government tear up parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol?
We're going to negotiate with the EU, but no options off the table.
Our message is quite clear. Don't touch this.
We'll talk about Northern Ireland with a government minister. After the Queen's speech, is it clear what Boris Johnson stands for? And is it Conservative enough for Steve Baker? Have you missed hearing from this man on social media?
Billionaire Elon Musk says he intends to reverse Twitter's ban on former President Donald Trump.
Hello and welcome. Let's start with this story in The Times. It's on the front page with the headline, "Neighbours get the right to vote on housing plans." It was something in one of the bills outlined in the Queen's speech yesterday under the plans for street votes. If at least 20% of residents submit a proposal for a street plan, the council must hold a binding local vote on it. Now, it would allow individual streets to allow development that goes significantly further than presently permitted development rights, which would allow loft conversions and extensions to go further than they do at the moment. Steve, would you vote to allow your neighbour's extension?
Well, I hope so. I hope I would, as I expect my neighbours, being very lovely people, would only do sensible things that didn't impinge on my own property. But that's the crucial point. What we need in the planning system is consent, because too often at the moment the planning system doesn't work for anyone, doesn't work for young people who need to get on the housing ladder, it doesn't work for existing property owners, and it's not delivering enough housing. So consent is really important. I think this is an important step forward.
Do you agree? Emily, would you vote to allow your neighbour's extension, conservatory, loft conversion?
I think this is just more piecemeal changes, little kind of tinkering around at the edges. I mean, I remember there was a time, wasn't there, when the Conservatives wanted the office blocks to be turned into flats, and, you know, there was a bit of kind of a rush on that, and then everyone sort of realised maybe that really wasn't a very good idea. What we need to do is we, of course, need to look again at our planning system. We need to see how are we going to get to net zero, how are we going to make sure that younger generation have somewhere to live, and I think it means radical reform of the planning system, but it does need, you know, absolutely to take it back to the beginning and look at it again. And I personally think I spent the morning actually with some developers talking about this very issue, and they were also talking about how many planning departments within local authorities have been stripped back, and it's quite difficult because they're so overstretched.
Why are you laughing?
Well, of course, I agree with Emily that we need radical reform of the planning system, but that's because what we need is people to have the power to say no, but the incentive to say yes. But what's making me laugh is, of course, the state land use planning system is the paradigmatic example of the set of ideas which Emily stands for, and it isn't working for anybody. So, yes, we do need quite bold reform, and what it needs to deliver in a nutshell is, as I say, that the power to say no, but all of the incentives to say yes. If we could deliver a system which did that, I think we might actually start getting young people on the housing ladder, which, my goodness, we certainly need to do.
I think that's something, you said something about paradigm, something or other. I mean, I presume that's something to do with the green belt and not having a green belt anymore. No. I mean, you don't want to have the big state, you know, ensuring that we don't build on the green belt. Listen, you know, what we need to be able to do is we have so little land in our country. We have a very large population. Of course, it needs to be managed. You can't just have red in tooth and claw capitalism, just like build wherever you like. Of course not. It needs to be managed properly, but we need to be clear about what our priorities are, which is giving homes for youngsters and making sure that we hit net zero.
Can I just say, nobody thinks this is the Wild West. I made a speech in the House of Commons years ago about this stuff and how we could do better. My voters loved it.
Right. Is it the Wild West, Caroline? What is this policy about?
Well, policy is supposed to be about giving people say about what's built in their backyard, but it's also supposed to be about incentivising house building and growth. The only thing that I'm slightly concerned about here is we haven't really seen the kind of nuts and bolts of how this would work. And I can't really imagine how local communities would come together to draw up a kind of housing plan. I mean, most of us don't have enough time in the day to do our own jobs, let alone that of the planning department. I can see why the government wants to do it, because when they've announced in the past things like extending permitted development so that that it's easier for people to build conservatories and loft conversions. It's been extremely, extremely popular. However, if my WhatsApp group of my local street is anything to go by, the minute anything is proposed, immediately the planning application goes around and everybody says no. So I think, you know, there are going to be issues with it. It will be popular in some quarters, but I think speaking to Steve's point there, one of the issues that concerns me is if you're going to incentivise people to, you know, build on their own properties, to make it bigger, how is that going to help young people onto the housing ladder? And as we were joking before I came in, my major concern is that this will just incentivise my children to stay at home for longer because they'll think that I can just extend my home and basically...
Oh, and you don't want that, do you?
Not forever. They're very welcome at the moment. But...
Well, that's good to know. I mean, this is one idea, Seb, from the Queen's speech. Is that because more radical plans mentioned by both Emily and Steve on planning and housing have been dropped?
I think it is that in the Conservatives' manifesto there was a house building target of 300,000 new homes a year. That seems to have disappeared. And the main reason for that is concerns from Conservative MPs in the South, who are the NIMBYs, the not in my backyard. And if we recall, Theresa May, the former Prime Minister, was one of those people who was very concerned about seeing the beautiful green and pleasant lands of Maidenhead being paved over. And there was a clear rebellion brewing against the original measures which were proposed by the then Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick, and Michael Gove has come in as Housing Secretary trying to calm the whole thing down and has come up with this plan which I think has some good things. It's good to give people local consent and local say, but there does need to be that sort of cultural shift Steve was talking about how we plan
But it is a classic Michael Gove, where he kind of waves his hands like a magician. He waves a hand, look over here, this is bright and shiny, but actually the other hand, frankly, in this case, doing nothing.
Final word, Steve.
What's the problem we face? If you're on median wages in Wickham, that's about £35,000 a year. Look at what you could buy for 5 times that. You'd struggle to buy a decent flat. And that's the problem we face, and we've got to solve it.
All right, well, that was just one of the things that came out of the bills announced yesterday in the Queen's speech. But what did it say broadly overall about the future direction of this government? Steve, this is what you said about the Prime Minister last month. Let's take a look.
The Prime Minister now should be long gone. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll certainly vote for this motion, but really, the Prime Minister should just know the gig's up.
Steve, is the gig still up for Boris Johnson, or is what you heard yesterday in the Queen's speech enough for you to give Boris Johnson a second chance?
Well, I separately said the Conservative Party was in the wrong place, heading in the wrong direction. What I was saying there was, of course, about the problem of Partygate. We're in the sad situation at the moment where, frankly, the hypocrisy of both leaders is what's really cutting through to the public. They think we're all as bad as each other when, frankly, we're not. Some of us meticulously abided by the law. But that particular remark was about Partygate, and I'd stand by what I said. If he'd been anybody else, he'd be long gone. But, you know, this is a good Queen's speech. I like it. I think it's a good platform to go forward to the next election. But does it solve the fundamental economic problems? Not really. And actually, unless we make the most of things like the Brexit Freedoms Bill, we are not going to get our economy into a place where it grows sufficiently to deal with the long-term economic challenges we all face.
So you are giving him a second chance?
Well, he is the Prime Minister. I've said what I've said, but I have also made it very clear I'm not going to campaign against him or seek to organise removing him. I'm just not going to do that.
I mean, it's ironic, isn't it, in some ways, Emily, that Steve Baker and other Conservative MPs had been calling for Boris Johnson to go just a few weeks ago, and yet the conversation now, and certainly since last Friday, has been about whether your leader, Keir Starmer, may have to resign.
Well, certainly when I was speaking to people on the doorstep, they were not talking about this. I mean, they were talking about being fed up with the Prime Minister. They did feel that he'd lied to them, and they did feel that he had laughed at them. But I, honest to God, did not have anyone speak to me about Keir Starmer and what may or may not have happened in Durham.
I suppose really the timing of that, though, really didn't actually coincide with the local elections and with campaigning.
Oh, I don't know. There was a lot of campaigning from Tory MPs and from certain Conservative Party supporting newspapers who were campaigning to bring it up.
Before Durham Police actually announced, which was on Friday, after the elections, to say that he was going to be investigated. I mean, it's just the sort of state of affairs, isn't it, in politics, that there's been all this focus on Boris Johnson and whether he should resign over the issues of parties, and now it's taken for Keir Starmer to come out and say he will resign if he receives a fixed penalty notice.
Well, that's the only right thing to do. Of course it is. If you've broken the law, and those are the very laws that you've introduced, and you've asked your party to vote for them, and whilst everyone else is sacrificing, of course, if you break the law, you should resign. That's what the Prime Minister should have done a long time ago.
I mean, it is notable, isn't it, Seb, that yesterday neither Keir Starmer nor Boris Johnson mentioned it at all or referenced it in the debate after the Queen's speech.
Well, obviously, the Beergate and Partygate are very different things we're talking about here, but it has, I think, for a lot of people become this a plague on all your houses, and I think for a lot of voters, they'll actually think it's quite like the MP's expenses scandal, even though there's very different instances and allegations we're talking about here. When I looked at the Queen's speech, if there was a culinary theme to it, it was red meat, and I'm not surprised Steve liked it, because it was almost as if the Prime Minister had gone through and stripped out any things that were unconservative in a way, and following those local election results where the Tories did pretty badly amongst their traditional voters, it's clear that the Prime Minister's way to try and reconnect with those MPs who are not happy with his leadership is to try and go back to core Conservative principles. So Brexit freedoms, reform of legislation, reform of human rights. But of course that doesn't get away from the leadership questions at the top of the Tory party, which are still there. And of course everyone's waiting to see, are there further fines? And if there are, that could flip the dynamic away from policy and back to leadership questions again.
I mean, Steve, do you agree with that? Because actually, in terms of having faith in Boris Johnson and the government and the direction, as you said yourself, they're not doing the sorts of things that you would like to see, cutting taxes and shrinking the state.
Well, look, so I think I've said on this programme before, we're never going to get to a small state in our lifetime, but we could at least try and balance the books and make sure that we don't default on the promises of the welfare state in our lifetime, which we're on course to do. I mean, look, what I'm trying to achieve is a prosperous and hopeful and free country where people can actually count on the pension being there, for example. If you look at the Government Actuary Department's report on the National Insurance Fund, it's very clear that from about 2043, we're going to be running out of money to pay the welfare state's benefits. Well, I would like to avoid that. So when I ask for lower taxes, that's because I would like greater economic growth. I would like greater economic growth to ensure the state, whoever's in power, can actually meet the promises it's made, because that's going to matter to those of us who are going to be in our 70s when this starts to happen.
Emily?
Well, can I first of all say that I hear what you say about this idea of a plague on both your houses, which is why it was so important for Keir to take the stand that he did, and to say at a time when there is increasing scepticism about politics, not just here in Britain but all across the world, it's really important for someone to actually take a principled stand and to say, I'm different, and I am honourable, and I am straightforward, and if I get fined, I will stand down. And that is in stark contrast to the current incumbent of number 10, and I think that that was a very important difference to draw.
Well, let me just get Steve's response to that. Was it principled stand? Do you agree?
Well, it puts far too much pressure on the police, because they now know that a decision that they take will have major political ramifications. I mean, we could, within a few weeks, be into leadership contests in both main governing parties. There are only two serious parties of government here. Both of them could be in leadership contests.
So do you
and to Seb's point, I'm afraid the truth is right now, it is a plague on all your houses. We've ended up in such a mess. I've had Labour MPs speak to me privately, even before Beergate, to say that their voters were telling them, you're all the same. We've got, as I indicated moments ago, we've got really serious problems we've got to be dealing with, and we're messing about talking about whether both main party leaders broke rules which both of them supported, which were plainly absurd, as I and others were pointing out at the time. It's the most monstrous situation we've been through. We've got to all of us in politics have got to provide a higher standard of leadership, and a really fundamental basic leadership point is that if you're taking people through hell, you have to go through it with them, not exempt yourself.
Can I just say this, right? Which is, are you really saying that by Keir saying, if you find me, I'm going to resign, I'm going to abide by the law, I'm not going to make a fuss, I don't believe that the Labour Party should be led by someone who has been found to have breached the law, that is putting undue pressure on the police? I mean, is that really where we've got to? You do remember, don't you, that Priti Patel yesterday at the Queen's speech was overheard speaking to one of the main people who've been writing to Durham Police and trying to put pressure on them to reopen this case, and telling him, haven't you done well, what great luck you've had recently? You know, I mean, they have been writing to the Durham Durham Police telling them that they should reopen it. They've been tweeting at them. I mean, there has been a campaign.
Well, these are pretty big claims. I mean,
well, it's...
As a rule, the police are not investigating historical allegations of rule breaking during COVID. They're doing it for the main party leaders, and they're right to, actually. But what we've got to do somehow is escape from this nightmare, which is distracting all of us from the serious problems that real people face, and somehow get on with addressing what they...
They have an incident room and 6 police officers, you know, focusing on this, which is fine, and I hope that they come to a conclusion this week, because, quite frankly, I think 6 police officers working on this could get through it all in a week. We don't need to keep dragging this out. But, you know, whatever conclusion they come to, Keir will abide by. If they say that he's breached the rules, they will have to fine him and he will have to
Emily,
resign.
can I ask you a very quick question, though?
Yeah.
So, Keir Starmer said he will resign if he gets fined.
Yeah.
What if Durham Police criticised his conduct or the conduct of that party but did not issue a fine? Because Durham Police don't have a record of retrospectively issuing fines. In that instance, and if it says, you know, he may have broken COVID rules but it doesn't get fined, what would he do then?
So I do think that it must be different now, because there wasn't, we all know that what we're talking about is Dominic Cummings, right? And there was not an incident room with 6 police officers. There wasn't all of this active investigation going on when it came to Dominic Cummings. If they find that he has broken the law, you know, the rules, that is...
Who's turned the lights off? Somebody... Oh, and they're back on.
If they find that he's broken the law, then it goes hand in hand. That's what the law says. He has to be fined. There is no middle way. He's either broken the law or he hasn't. And if they say that he's broken the rules, then he will be fined, then he will resign. That's it.
Caroline?
I think he didn't have very much choice in what he said when he basically said he was going to resign. I mean, we know that, you know, Keir prides himself on being a man of integrity and has a very high sort of moral bar. And basically there was nothing to lose, I think, in him saying that this is what I would do in the event that was fine. But I think Emily does raise an interesting point there about what could happen, given that the Barnard Castle incident is basically the bar upon which the police seem to be making their judgments. And they did say in the case of Dominic Cummings that they would have issued words of warning had they have been alerted to the issue at the time. But there was nothing that could be done retrospectively. In this case, given what we've seen happen with Scotland Yard and Partygate and the intervention of the Metropolitan Police, it does, I think, put pressure on Durham Police to actually use the same yardstick that they've measured the conduct of the Prime Minister
but we're fine with
the
that.
leader of the opposition.
We're fine with that.
All right.
This is a completely different situation. The guy was having something to eat whilst he was working. This is very different to industrial style number 10 partying that was going on, where it's an address that's had more parties than any other address in the whole of Britain during
Did Keir go back to work afterwards?
Of course he did.
OK, that's good.
I mean, just before we move on, I mean, Steve, talking earlier, listening to you, you sound down about Boris Johnson leadership. I mean, you're sticking with it because of where we are, but you think it's pretty atrocious, the situation that politics has found itself in. All right, with both leaders, but you are obviously doing this reluctantly.
Certainly I'm doing it reluctantly. I helped Boris Johnson become Prime Minister and I helped him get a majority of 80, and I'm extremely sad that it's come to this. But the reality is we should all be here to serve the public and the real problems they face. And I would just observe that in this conversation, I think we've agreed that there's a massive problem getting young people into homes, which is the foundation of their future. I've got all the figures here to show the welfare state's going to default in our lifetime. And we're talking about whether or not Keir Starmer went back to work after he'd had a beer with a few people. We have got... Well, indeed. But we've just got to get off this nonsense one way or the other and get on with the real problems we face.
All right, we're going to talk about those. Let me apologise for the lights. I think I must have put my foot on the wrong switch accidentally. We're going to talk about the Northern Ireland Protocol, that key part of the government's Brexit deal, which means Northern Ireland follows the EU's rules for goods. Now, after last week's elections, the Democratic Unionist Party is refusing to join a power-sharing government until the protocol is removed. We can talk to the Minister for Northern Ireland, Conor Burns. He is in Washington, meeting politicians there to talk about precisely this issue of the protocol. Now, the Foreign Secretary is going to talk to the EU tomorrow, Conor Burns. You're in Washington today. What are you trying to achieve?
Well, hello, Jo. I'm here all week. I started my visit to the United States in Boston, meeting representatives of the Irish-American community, meeting the governor of Massachusetts. I've been meeting people on the Hill, people in civic society here in Washington, and meeting people from the administration, and really just trying to explain, look, the United States is hugely invested in what happened over the last 24 years since the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. And we just want our friends and allies in the United States to understand the context of the challenges that the protocol is throwing up, the pressure that it is putting on the institutions in Northern Ireland, so that they are aware of our thinking, aware of the challenges we're facing, and cited on what steps we may have to take if we can't come to a negotiated agreement to recalibrate the protocol with our European friends.
All right. I mean, Conor, we've already had a statement from Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary. We're showing it to our guests and viewers now, and it's aimed at the EU. It says, our preference has always been for a negotiated solution, but we'll not shy away from taking action to stabilise the situation in Northern Ireland if solutions can't be found. What is the action she's talking about?
Well, Jo, look, essentially what we have been saying to the EU is there needs to be a difference between the checks on goods that are carried out for goods coming into Northern Ireland that are destined to be consumed in Northern Ireland, and those goods that are for transition through Northern Ireland into the Irish Republic and therefore into the European single market. And the challenge is that the bureaucracy, the costs, the paperwork on the goods going into Northern Ireland are immense. I mean, one of the things I'm showing, Jo, one of the things I've brought with me, this is the bundle of documents that has to be filled out by companies moving goods within our own country.
Right, so what action is the Foreign Secretary talking about that the UK government will take?
Well, the first thing the Foreign Secretary is saying, we want to reach a settlement with the EU.
And we have
said it's almost, Northern Ireland likes anniversaries. It's almost the first anniversary of the United Kingdom government saying that we thought we were within our rights to trigger the provisions of Article 16 because the protocol was causing significant
Article 16 to override parts of the protocol. And is that what you're prepared to do?
And the bit that is rarely referred to, Jo, is Article 13, which envisages a renegotiation of the protocol, or indeed an entirely new agreement to replace the protocol. So we're trying to engage with the EU. But what we're saying, Jo, not a single unionist was elected to the Assembly over the weekend who supports the protocol as it is currently being implemented and understood. And that has got to change because the protocol, which was put in place in part to protect the institutions of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, is now the biggest threat to the institutions born out of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And it would be irresponsible for us if the EU will not widen Vice President Šefčovič's negotiating mandate to simply stand back and do nothing.
All right, well, we already know what Maroš Šefčovič has said in response, the Commission Vice President. He says the protocol, as a cornerstone of the withdrawal agreement, is an international agreement. Its renegotiation is not an option. The European Union is united in this position. So I ask again, what action are you going to take?
Well, the first point, Jo, is to refer to Article 13, Section 8, that says any subsequent agreement between the Union and the United Kingdom shall indicate the parts of this protocol which it supersedes. Once a subsequent agreement between the Union and the United Kingdom becomes applicable after the entry into force of the withdrawal agreement, this protocol shall then, from the date of the application of such subsequent agreement, and according this is important, will cease to apply. So the EU themselves have said in the document that we have written with them that this can be reopened, this can be renegotiated, there is a way to recalibrate the protocol.
Right, well, hang on.
Our ask, Jo, is very straightforward.
Right, go on.
Well, look, Macron's election's behind him. What we need now to see is the European Union politically giving Šefčovič a wider mandate that allows him to move beyond the position that he has got to, and he has said he can't go any further. If he can't go any further, the UK government cannot sit back and watch a part of our United Kingdom not have devolved government, not unlock the £300 million of Barnett consequentials that would be available to the executive to deal with cost of living and all the other challenges that our fellow citizens in Northern Ireland are facing, as Steve's constituents in Wickham and mine in Bournemouth. We've got to get the institutions back up and running, and the protocol is now the impediment to that.
Right, and it's that serious that the UK government, you would be prepared to unilaterally override parts of that protocol?
We will take action to protect our citizens in Northern Ireland, to protect the institutions of devolved government in Northern Ireland. This supersedes everything else, the duty we have, the obligation we have to our own citizens, to stable government, to peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland. We still want, and this is very, very important, Jo, we still want a negotiated solution. But if your negotiating partner is at the point of saying, there's nothing to talk about, then we have a moral obligation to take action to protect our citizens in Northern Ireland.
Right, and all I'm trying to understand is what that action actually is. Is that action for a bill, for law, to be introduced next week to give you the capacity to override that protocol?
Well, look, Jo, it would be inappropriate for me to tell you and to tell this programme and your viewers what the government intends to do before ministers have told Parliament. The Foreign Secretary will come to Parliament and explain it. But essentially what we need to do is get to the point where you don't have to fill in all of this to move goods within your country that are destined for sale and consumption in your company. I use the example of, there are manufacturers, over 200 companies in Great Britain who have simply decided to stop supplying to Northern Ireland. When you've got to the point that you need veterinary certificates for shortbread that is consumed in Northern Ireland, sold in Northern Ireland supermarkets, when you've got to the point where a container load of goods for Sainsbury's requires the same level of checks when there are no Sainsbury's supermarkets in the Irish Republic as goods going to the Irish Republic, something has gone wrong.
Although I understand, and you need the EU to come back to the negotiating table. They have so far said very firmly that is not going to happen. Another person who doesn't think the protocol should be unilaterally scrapped by the UK is Theresa May, the former Prime Minister. She says government ministers like you need to consider what such a move would say about the United Kingdom and its willingness to abide by treaties that it has signed. What would you say to her?
Well, look, I would say to Theresa, whose negotiating stance led to the challenges that led to the protocol, I would say look at what the protocol actually says. Look at the provisions of Article 16, where there are moves within it, mechanisms within it for either side to unilaterally take safeguarding actions if there are societal implications. And I would say to Theresa May that when not a single unionist was elected in the unionist designation in Stormont, and it is the major block to the reformation of devolved government in Northern Ireland, that is clearly a societal impact. And I think I would say to Theresa, our request of the EU is a perfectly moderate, reasonable one that I think most people, when we explain it, think the UK is actually doing the right thing here. We don't want to legislate unilaterally, but we have got a duty above all to the citizens of our United Kingdom in Northern Ireland to fix this.
You're in Washington. You're going to be there all week. Have any American politicians told you so far they would support the UK taking the sort of unilateral action that we've discussed?
Well, look, I have taken a number of American politicians through the challenges we face, explained the political context, explained the technical difficulties of the protocol in terms of movements of goods within our own country. And I think there is an understanding, a growing realisation when you look at this bundle of paperwork and so on, of the very real challenge that the protocol is putting on the political institutions in Northern Ireland. And the one thing that the Americans want to see is a restoration of devolved government. As I said to you earlier, they are hugely invested in this, the role of successive administrations, successive presidents,
but would they support that
Hill.
action?
We haven't taken action, so in that sense the question doesn't yet arise. We are not at the point of introducing legislation. We are still at the point of trying to get the EU to come back to the negotiating table, to ask the political leadership in the European Union to give Ursula von der Leyen the instruction to widen Vice President Šefčovič's mandate, get round the table and see if we can find the technical solutions we need to fix this protocol for the people of Northern Ireland. But that if we can't, and it will not be the UK being belligerent on this, it will be that our negotiating partner has stopped talking to us, and therefore we will have to take action for our citizens in Northern Ireland.
Conor Burns in Washington, thank you very much. Steve, should the UK government be prepared to take that unilateral action and override the protocol?
Yeah, of course, and we'd be on the moral high ground in doing so. So if I may just run through a few reasons. First, the protocol foresees exactly the kinds of problems that we currently have, and as Conor explained, makes provision to be replaced. Secondly, I am absolutely confident that we will protect the EU's interests in what we do, and I have been briefed on what I think is likely to happen.
They might need some
and I expect we'll do that. The third point is that the Good Friday Agreement, which everyone is committed to protecting, applies east-west as well as north-south. And I'm afraid some of the people who are insisting on it clearly want a united Ireland and are neglecting that fact that it applies east-west. EU ambassadors have told me time and again that they respect the territorial integrity of the UK. OK, that's great, but I'm calling them out. If they respect the territorial integrity of the UK, then we should not have additional checks on goods not at risk going between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And finally, I'd say that question comes up about good faith and duress here. We signed up to that treaty under considerable internal political duress in the UK.
But you did sign up to it?
Yeah, under considerable duress. And incidentally, because it makes provision to solve the problems which it identifies and to be superseded. But bottom line for me is Liz Truss now is very clearly gripping this problem. She must be doing it with the Prime Minister's endorsement. We've got Jacob Rees-Mogg in the Cabinet. We've got Suella Braverman in the Cabinet. They're clearly all involved in this problem. And I have got great faith that we can get through this on the moral high ground, solve the problem, protect the EU's interests and move forward. And we should be able to do it as friends and partners.
Do you have faith in that, Emily?
I never thought that I'd hear Conor Burns implying that the Northern Ireland Protocol that Boris Johnson negotiated was somehow or other Theresa May's fault. I mean, honestly, they flounder around trying to blame everyone but themselves. But, you know, the government starts by saying that they want to protect the Good Friday Agreement, and obviously that's right. But they have to go. They have to operate in a way which is going to generate agreement. And them saying, unless you agree with us, we're going to pull out, we're going to take our toys away, we're going to tear up this agreement, is not the way to do it. And, you know, Conor Burns is in America because the Americans have said that they've been blindsided. You know, all of this has been going on and it hasn't been explained to them. So he's out there trying to explain that. But, you know, if we're going to proceed in the context of the Good Friday Agreement, we have to also not only bring the EU with us, but the rest of the Irish government and the Americans. And there has been very little attempt, I think, to do that. There's been a lot of attempt to try and make sure that backbench Tory MPs are fine about it. But actually, the wider context is much more important. And we have to remember, in the end, this was the agreement that Boris Johnson said was oven ready and was ready to go. And it's his fingerprints are all over it. And he has to make sure that it's going to work. Now, I can make some suggestions on how I think that it could be improved. I think, for example, there is no reason at all why we shouldn't have a veterinary agreement with the European Union. A veterinary agreement is just basically saying our food standards are as good, if not higher, than the European Union ones.
And this would be for the whole of the UK
for the whole of Europe, so that we could then export Cheshire cheese to the rest of Europe, which we can't do at the moment without huge amounts of paperwork. And we can see that our trade with the European Union is nosediving because of it.
Steve?
Well, clearly we should have agreements with the European Union. I'm all in favour of agreements. They should be consistent with being an independent state. But look, the reason fundamentally why we've got this set of problems...
Why don't we have a veterinary agreement with them then?
I'm all in favour of having an appropriate veterinary agreement. But by appropriate,
we don't have one at all.
By appropriate, I mean one which allows us to continue to govern ourselves. I don't mind us having veterinary agreements with other countries like New Zealand, where standards are equivalent.
Well, you have to have a veterinary agreement with them.
The point that I was trying to make is that the reason we've got so much difficulty is because too many people in the political establishment refused to accept that the consequence of a vote to leave was that the UK would be outside the legal construct which was the EU. And the farce that we had of the British political establishment wrestling to have Brexit in name only led the EU and every other player to think that the UK was going to fall over and stay within the EU's legal structures.
Steve, I'm quite sure you don't...
And that is why, in the end, we were not able to negotiate from a position of strength, because I'm afraid people like Emily undermined the UK's negotiating strength by sending all the wrong signals about our intentions. If they'd accepted the result, as I would have done, we would have gone forward strongly.
Any trade agreement, right, between any two countries, whether it's Britain and the European Union, Britain and New Zealand, Britain with any other trading blocs, we have to say, you sell us this water, it has to be to the same standard as our water. You therefore have to have an agreement as to what the basic standards are. And when it comes to food, we export our biggest manufacturing industry is food manufacturing. And we are unable at the moment to export properly to the European Union because we don't have an agreement with the European Union. That's the bottom and top of it. Don't start saying this is somehow my fault. This is the fault of Boris Johnson, who said he had an oven-ready agreement and it was inadequate and it was signed on Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
It has all sorts of holes in it, and he has been unable to fill those holes because he spent his time squabbling about Northern Ireland.
Seb?
Look, the fact is that the government's in a hole on this whole Northern Ireland position, and I think sensible people within Whitehall will say they acknowledge there do need to be some checks, and there were checks, in fact, before Brexit on SPS checks of animals moving between Ireland and Great Britain. So the question is, how can you unlock the negotiating position to get the checks that will work? Because I think this idea that the legislation that Conor Burns was hinting at in that interview earlier, that could come as soon as next week. And that will only just start the ball rolling on another process of passing that legislation. I'm sure the House of Lords would have one or two things to say about that. And to me, it feels like that whole thing is a gambit to try and unlock a better negotiating position with the EU. But as we saw with Brexit the first time around, if you get the circumstances incorrect or wrong and you misread, it can backfire quite a lot.
Well, in terms of misreading, and perhaps the EU doesn't think the UK government is serious about what they are hinting at, talking about what Steve would like to see if there isn't agreement. The Belgian Prime Minister has warned that if the protocol is revoked, then the whole system, the entire Brexit trade deal, will also be revoked. Do you think they really mean that and the UK government's prepared to risk it?
There's a lot of brinkmanship going on here, and I think that that's the clear thing that we have to sort of explain here, is that this has been an issue which has been ongoing now for some time. We expected that they were going to bring this to a sort of crunch point shortly before Christmas. It didn't happen, but now we've got to this really critical moment because of what's happened in Northern Ireland. They're going to use the pressure that we have there, which is that we can't see any kind of executive reforming there, which puts us in breach of the Good Friday Agreement, and they are going to use that pressure to say, look, there is going to be political instability in Northern Ireland. There's certainly been intelligence to suggest that there could be a summer of violence in the province if this isn't fixed, which we have seen in the past. We saw it last summer to a certain extent, although that was largely blamed on kind of paramilitaries that were using it as an excuse, but we could see genuine instability in the province as a consequence of this. So the Foreign Secretary is using that now as her leverage to say, we need to fix this. And of course, on the other side, you've got the European Union hitting back and saying, actually, if you do this, there'll be a trade war.
Exactly, and we'll have a trade war in the middle of a cost of living crisis. And I mean, it just couldn't be more irresponsible.
Are you prepared to risk that?
This question's been asked and answered in a general election. Get Brexit done was the big slogan. The public were asked, would you like us to do that? There were enormous risks involved in doing it, in standing firm and leaving well. The question was asked and answered. We got an 80-seat majority. I just hope that
Labour... You've just got to make it work. You've got to make it work properly and not behave like this.
Emily, you would not tolerate me talking over you. The question was asked and answered, and I really hope that Labour voters in those red wall seats are listening to Emily's attitude to how we go forward. Because I think
well, if you'd like to hear what my attitude is that we should make Brexit work by being prepared to negotiate with the European Union and having things like an agreement on the standard of food. Are we really saying that our food standards are not as good as the Europeans?
The trouble is...
Well, it's a good job you two aren't negotiating on this, but anyway...
Emily wants is harmonisation, and that is Brexit in name only.
Well, I'm glad you know what I want, because you don't listen to a word
There is a strange feeling of deja vu I'm having. Now, we're going to talk about it all over again. What a retro year that was. We're going to talk about Twitter because billionaire Elon Musk is in talks, as you know, to buy the social media platform. Last night, he was interviewed by the Financial Times, and here's what he had to say about former US President Donald Trump's ban from the site.
It was not correct to ban Donald Trump. I think that was a mistake. Because it alienated a large part of the country and did not ultimately result in Donald Trump not having a voice.
So, Twitter kicked Donald Trump off its platform in January last year. You may remember days after the US Capitol was stormed by his supporters. The company said the former president's tweets repeatedly violated its rules and cited concerns over a risk of further incitement of violence. Elon Musk, as you heard there, is keen to reverse that decision. Emily, should Donald Trump be allowed back on Twitter?
No, I think that they should apply the rules and they should carry on applying the rules. It shouldn't be just because someone else has taken over that somehow or other they don't have to apply the rules anymore. I mean, we have to be very careful about disinformation. We know that Donald Trump plays that game completely. And frankly, I think that, that the man should not be allowed. He cannot trust him to tell anything like the truth. And no, if the rules mean anything, then Donald Trump should not be on Twitter.
One of the other things Elon Musk said was that Twitter has a strong left-wing bias. Was he right to say that, Steve?
Well, I mean, I think that's probably true. But
Really?
if I may, I would say that we used to believe that things like, I despise what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And that is not the world we live in today, unfortunately. And I do think we should. But clearly there need to be legal bounds. Nobody should be able to incite violence. But this is a really important and present question now because of the online safety bill. Should we really have a fuzzy area of law where what you say and write can be banned when it's harmful but lawful? And it's a really difficult area. I want to live in a world where people are civilised and kind to one another in what they say and how they approach questions. But actually, we should be willing to defend very powerfully people's right to say what they think, because in the end that's how we call out bad people, and that is how civilization makes progress. Freedom of thought and expression. I want civilization to make progress, and that means freedom of speech.
Well, we have to tackle extreme content. We have to tackle scams,
nobody's saying we
fraud.
don't.
We have to protect children. There needs to be, I think, an online safety bill that is not the dog's dinner that we understand that the government's about to produce, largely because of backbenchers who are trying to sort of shred it, as far as I can see. So we have a double problem, I think, at the moment, where we have potential changes with Twitter, which have frankly been bad enough as it is, along with having an online safety bill, which is going to be pretty pusillanimous.
Right. Well, let's bring it closer to home and talk about the discourse and the impact of Twitter on politics. FT headline, something you've been writing about, Seb. Twitter's bubbles are a blight on British politics. Why?
Well, I think I arrived in political journalism about the time Twitter started to enter into the mainstream of Westminster. And it just occurred to me, not just through the Brexit wars, but in probably the past sort of year or two, the fact is Twitter dominates absolutely everything. And for journalists like Caroline and I, it's great to see what's going on with the news in a quick and easy way. But there is a danger for us and for MPs that they think that is the voice of the country and that things that matter on Twitter matter to everyone. The fact is they don't. And as I argued in that FT column, the fact is almost nothing matters on Twitter. That doesn't mean Twitter itself doesn't matter. What people are talking about, I don't always think has a huge amount of relevance. And I think it's responsible for a lot of the short-term, short-horizon thinking in our politics at the moment, because stories come and go. Politicians have to respond. You two might be trending on Twitter by the end of this programme for your debate about Brexit. Is that going to solve the Northern Ireland Protocol? No. Is that going to get us to a better debate in Parliament? No. But that may impact how you think about and talk about it in the future and how Caroline and I write about things.
Caroline?
I thought one of the things that was really interesting in Seb's piece was he talked about the Labour Party and actually some of the internal machinations of the Labour Party. And I've heard it time and time again, this suggestion that they really would like MPs to take Twitter off their phones.
The Tory party would too.
Well, I'm sure the Tories would too, but I thought your point being that, Boris Johnson doesn't look at Twitter at all. And yet we see a sort of very compulsive behaviour from some of the sort of left-wing MPs on Twitter. And it does become a kind of echo chamber. And I think that's what the issue is. Some of the stories that perhaps don't mean anything to, your bread and butter, general public, like, for example, the Angela Rayner story last week, went absolutely massive on Twitter. But is that really what voters are talking about when they're at home, when they're facing a cost of living crisis? I suspect not.
Emily?
I think there's a lot in what you say, and I think that we have to be very careful to remain grounded, which does mean actually speaking to our constituents. It means getting up and down the country and listening to what people are saying. That isn't to say, though, that Twitter doesn't have its uses. I mean, I use it for organising things. I use it for when I want to kind of put out a message and catch up on various things that are happening in the Westminster bubble. But so long as you keep it in context. And on Saturday night, during the Eurovision Song Contest, I will be on Twitter because it comes into a beautiful world at that time.
Well, 16 million users on Twitter in the UK, but it does have a significant impact, doesn't it, Steve?
It absolutely does. I think that Seb wrote a brilliant article. I broadly agree with him. What I would say is it's great for getting a national message out. It's absolutely terrible for telling me what the people of Wickham think, and that's really what I want to know. What do voters in Wickham think? And I can't get that from
I don't know if we've got time, but you used a couple of examples, Seb. One about the government's rail plan last November collapsing after impact with Twitter, and Keir Starmer's reshuffle collapsing in real time because of Twitter. Very quickly to show you this tweet, deciding to reshuffle from you, the shadow cabinet, while your deputy leader is giving a keynote speech on taking on the Tories, is proper galaxy brain stuff from Labour. Is this the sort of stuff you mean?
It is exactly the sort of stuff I mean. I should take my own advice much better.
Ah, I see. I can see you there. Anyway, that was a little bit naughty, wasn't it? From all of us here, thank you very much. I will be back tomorrow at 12:15. Bye-bye.